today we're looking at some commentary. After all these testings, Jesus is with a group of people. He's speaking to the crowds and to his disciples specifically, those who believe that he is this coming king, that he is Emmanuel, God with us, and just to the crowds in general, and commenting on the religious and political leaders of the day. So we walk into that, and he's going to point out over the next 2 or 3 weeks some inconsistencies that he sees with the leadership, especially with religious leadership. And so maybe a part of the way that God opens your eyes through this is to see some inconsistencies in people who are trying to give you leadership and guidance in your life. Or maybe it's some personal inconsistencies where you're going to see yourself revealed through those religious leaders, and aspects of them that you would maybe earlier have stepped back and criticized now will become those things where you realize, this is something in my life that I need to make a change in so that I more accurately reflect Jesus in the way that he wants me to live and follow him as well. So there might be some different applications from that. But we're looking at some of those inconsistencies of the people who call themselves the teachers, the instructors, the leaders at this point in time. And we'll look at 3 different aspects of that inconsistency today. I'm going to start off with the story. When I was in college, I worked a series of different summer jobs. And those summer jobs, the point of it was just to earn enough money for the next semester or something, or extra money to help pay off my college bill. I wasn't particularly choosy, so I was willing to do pretty much anything for summer jobs. And one summer I had a chance to work on an assembly line at a factory, making automotive parts, which is exciting, thrilling. You do the same process 1,300 to 1,500 times every single day, delightful. But I remember one person who stood out to me at that job was a guy who was my manager. I don't remember his name because that was 20-some years ago, but I remember his face and I remember his character, because he would always step in. He was over our entire assembly line, but whenever he saw somebody falling behind, which is normally me because I was, a temporary hire for the summer, he would step in and do the job at lightning speed to catch the line up. Or if somebody called in sick, he would do their job all shift because he knew every single aspect of the assembly line. And he was a very hands-on manager who was willing to step in and take on any role that any one of us were doing. And I found that to be very impressive. But imagine that he had a different personality and approach to leadership as a manager. Imagine he would just sit up in an office all day, look down on us, watch us doing our jobs as he sipped his cup of coffee, and he would meet with the other managers over the different assembly lines every day and just, look down upon us and figure out different ways, strategize with them about more demands that he could put on us. How could he get more productivity out of the line? Maybe he could reduce our break by 10 or 15 minutes, or cut off some time from our lunch hour, or demand more products per day, or keep us there later in the day until we achieved our goals. And the purpose of this was so that he and the other managers could just get raises, or maybe get promoted to other positions so they could do the same thing over larger groups of people in the company. How would you view a manager like that? Somebody who is all talk but no action, right? How would you view somebody like that? We've become more interactive in our Sunday mornings here over the last couple of months. So what would you think of a man? Maybe some of you have had managers like that. What would you think of a manager who is all about supervising and not about doing anything?
I want his salary.
You want his salary? Okay. Maybe somebody higher up in the company would be willing to make a trade if that was the case, huh? I don't know. How would you feel about that manager?
He's not a true team leader.
He's not a true team leader, okay. He's not really a part of the team at all, right? Critical, kind of a critical person. We all love critical people. Sometimes we are that critical person, right? Anything else? Lazy, what? Self-seeking. He's all about, ultimately all about himself. And I think we'll see that come to surface in just a few moments as well. Yeah, when it comes down to it, he doesn't really care about people. He cares about himself, getting a promotion, right? So he's not willing to act. And that's sort of what we see Jesus start to comment on toward the religious leaders. It's this area of action, or we might say inaction. It says he spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, his students, and said, the scribes and the Pharisees, they are seated in the chair of Moses. So scribes are Jewish leaders who are spending the majority of their time copying down the Old Testament scriptures, what we call the Old Testament today, the Hebrew parts of the Bible, onto scrolls so that different synagogues and places throughout Israel and even throughout the Roman Empire can have access to those. The Jewish community can read them on their Saturdays, their Sabbaths, their worship time. So they're always copying down the words of God, so to speak. The Pharisees are people who are very, very zealous for different, not only scriptures, but applying all these different traditions of how to carry out specific Jewish laws that have been passed on for generations. And they're all about the fine details, so to speak. And he says they're seated in the chair of Moses. And that's a metaphor at this time. It's a metaphor for somebody who has authority to teach and interpret the laws that Moses gave, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and just the scriptures in general. So somebody who's considered a spiritual authority figure who can teach, who can give interpretation. And over time, in fact, by a couple centuries at the time of Jesus, by the 3rd century AD, the synagogues had actually built special chairs in the synagogue for the people that had that authority to interpret God's word and give kind of the final rulings. And so you got to sit in a special seat every morning. Think about that. If we had a special seat up here on the stage for anybody who is considered qualified to teach the Bible in this church, what would that do? How would that set people apart, right? And so that's what they were doing. They claimed that authority. And Jesus said in verse 3 of Matthew 23, therefore do whatever they say to you and keep watch over it, because they were saying some accurate things. They were reading some of the Old Testament scriptures. And so a lot of what they were saying, it was good information. But Jesus says, don't imitate their actions, because they say things and they don't do them. They're like the manager who says, I want you to do this, but myself, I'm unwilling. In fact, Jesus says in verse 4, they keep chaining up heavy loads that are hard to carry and keep laying them on people's shoulders. So they come up with more and more difficult things that you have to do to please God and earn God's acceptance. And it's like chains and burdens, and they're just piling them on the people who are listening to them every week in the synagogue, or people that they're having religious conversations with. But Jesus says they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them. They're up in the office sipping coffee, watching everybody else, coming up with a plan for everyone else to get more committed to God and more spiritual. But when it comes down to it, there's a lot of things that they're unwilling to do themselves. So they put heavy demands on people to follow different rules, spiritual rules, to live disciplined lives. They had a very disciplined prayer life. At that point in time, they would pray certain times of the day, oftentimes repetitive prayers every morning, every evening. Go to the temple if they were close to Jerusalem and pray at 3 o'clock every afternoon when the afternoon sacrifice was ascending. And so there were all these rigorous demands. They would talk about service to other people. They would talk about the importance, I think, and we don't see a lot of this in the New Testament, but I think if they're teaching the Old Testament scriptures, they're probably saying a lot about justice and a lot about compassion and a lot about mercy and a lot about God's kindness. But when you get to meet these individuals, they don't have the character to back it up at all. They're unwilling. They don't want to show mercy, but they're telling the people, be merciful, walk humbly, be humble before God, fear the Lord. And in their hearts, they don't want any part of it. They're selfish, like you pointed out. They want people to observe all the traditions and go to great lengths, but yet there are certain things that they will say, I don't feel like that. I don't want to lift up a finger to do that. It's too difficult today. So they just decide, we're the leaders, so we have the luxury of picking and choosing what we're going to do. We've already arrived. We kind of figured out what's really important. So we'll tell other people all the things they have to do, and we'll pick and choose. We'll disregard what's difficult or the things that don't get us noticed, because we all know that you can serve people in a lot of ways that someone will never know, right? You can do things that get totally overlooked. In fact, many of you do those things. Whether you're a parent, you're doing it for your kids, whether you're a caregiver, whether it's your occupation and you're doing stuff off the clock, or you're just doing stuff that nobody ever notices. Or maybe you're serving even in this church community in ways like you're coming over to mow the lawn. The lawn is mowed. It looks amazing. You know how that happened? The lawn angel showed up this week, right? And one of you is that lawn angel. And it goes unnoticed. And some people, the Pharisees, the leaders, the religious leaders, they didn't want the task that wouldn't get them any attention. We'll find that out in just a moment. So they'd pick and choose. I think there's a good question here. Do my religious teachers and leaders put heavy demands on me? If they do, maybe you should ask some more questions. Maybe you should consider whether or not your religious leaders, or the people that you look up to in your faith or your spiritual journey, really should be the people that you look up to in your faith or your spiritual journey. Maybe they shouldn't be the people that you're listening to. Also, do my religious leaders diligently carry out difficult tasks? And do they look around at the needs of other people, of their neighbors? Are they selfless, or are they just self-absorbed? What do you do if you see inconsistencies? Let me pose that as a question. Let's say you have some people that you're looking up to. Maybe it's people you listen to their sermons on the radio or their podcast. Maybe it's people you watch, church services online with TV. Maybe it's a Bible study group that you attend. Maybe it's a church that you attend. Maybe it's this church that you attend, and you look at your leaders and you see some inconsistencies. Like they're requiring a lot of things of us, but they're just not really willing to, roll their sleeves up, so to speak, and get their hands dirty and serve other people. Or they're really demanding. How do you think you should respond to that? This is an open question. Yeah.
In the past, I responded probably wrongly.
Okay, well, tell me some different possible responses. What's one?
Well, the one would be that I probably judged them wrong, or I looked up to them more highly than I should have. But then later, when I was able to observe them and how they treated me or the others, that I opted to either quit or leave.
Okay, so one option might be maybe initially we look up to people more than we should. We really put them on a pedestal. And then eventually you said maybe one option is that we get to this point where we just realize we have to leave, we have to separate ourselves from that. And maybe that's the case. Maybe we do, maybe we should. What are some other possible responses? What do you think? If you see that in leadership, what could you do?
Maybe have a conversation with them.
Have a conversation with them. Did you know that's one thing that people hate to do? Anything that, it's termed as confrontational, I guess, but it's so hard to have a conversation with someone and say, I see something that I'm really concerned about in your life. Because one, we don't know how they're going to respond. It's fearful a lot of times for us. But really bringing up a concern is pretty much the only way to bring up a concern. We have to have a conversation. We have to say something. Problems don't solve themselves. And we also have to remember that we need to be a listener and a learner. When we approach someone else, they may have a perspective that we haven't seen. So we have to be open to that as well. We might have misjudged that situation. So it can go both ways. But that's great for clearing up, what's true and what people's motives really are. Just having that conversation. Yeah. Those are good thoughts. Yes?
That's why you have to pray for wisdom. It's written that you're supposed to stand firm and the move will know that you're working the Lord is not in vain. Faith without works is dead faith. So you have to put in that work and you have to be willing to stand up for what you know and believe, through our Savior in prayer.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, you have to be willing to stand up for what you know and believe. You have to pray for wisdom in those situations. Yeah, and not just ignore things and let them go. Yeah.
Maybe come alongside them and help them and support them because it might be something that they're not even aware of.
That's great. Yeah, come alongside of them and help support them. That's the word that's used for the Holy Spirit in the New Testament, the one who comes alongside you. It's like he wraps his arm around you and walks with you and helps you grow and supports you as you learn, as you change. So maybe that's what that person needs. Just because somebody's in a leadership position doesn't mean that they don't need some guidance and some support, somebody who'll be there. And, we all have different experiences. We've all learned different things. And maybe you can actually share a lot of wisdom and helpful information or a different way to approach leading with somebody even though they're already in that position. Maybe you've had experience or you just see a different way or a better way. Those are all great answers. And so they were unwilling for whatever reason to take action, and a lot of people were unwilling to bring it up. But in this conversation, Jesus is going to at least bring this up, bring it to light. And maybe there's some Pharisees and scribes in the audience. We don't know that at this point in time. Another thing about this group of people is that they're very centered on attention. They're motivated by attention. Jesus says next in verse 5, they do all their actions to be admired by other people. So when it comes down to it, human approval is what's motivating these religious leaders, at least the bulk of them, in the time when Jesus is interacting with them. And so let me throw this question out to you. Is pleasing people, because that's what their motive was. Their motive was just to please people to gain attention. Is that a good motive? How many people say yes? Pleasing people is a great motive. Okay? And this is where it gets interesting because maybe there are times where it is. How many of you would say pleasing people is a bad motive? How many of you would say it's a little bit of both? How many of you would say, I don't like raising my hand in a public place? Yeah. When might it be good to be motivated to please people? Yeah.
When it's motivated by love.
Okay.
If we're motivated by fear to please others, or we're insecure, so we need to build ourselves up and push other people
Okay, so for example, if I'm motivated to please my wife because I love her, is that a good thing? Probably, right? If I'm motivated to please people because I'm afraid of how they're going to react or of what's going to happen to me or my position if I don't please people, is that a good motive? Probably not, right? So fear and love, that's a huge thing. Anybody else? Yes?
Personal gain.
Personal. Okay.
Status.
Okay, sure. If you're pleasing people for personal gain, it comes back to that selfishness, or status, so people will put you on a pedestal in the community, which I think is pretty clear from what Jesus says was the case here, then those are bad motives. Any more thoughts on that? When pleasing people is good or bad? Yes?
When you please people because you have a heart to serve others,
Okay.
I think that's good.
Okay, so if your heart is to genuinely serve people and you want to please them. Yeah, I work a second job at a hotel right now, some days out of the week. And yeah, I want to please people, but it's because it's a hospitality industry thing, right? I want to serve them. I want them to feel comfortable and welcome. So maybe that's another reason where it's good. But the type of motivation that's motivating these religious leaders in Jesus' day to gain approval from people is largely attention-driven in a negative sense. And Jesus gives some examples, very practical examples of what he sees in their lives to reveal some of that to us and maybe to cause us to look at our lives as well and do some personal examination and analysis. He says they enlarge their phylacteries. That's kind of a weird word, so we'll get to that in a second. And they make their tassels conspicuous. I put some brackets in here because if you read this in the Christian Standard Bible, which is the translation I'm using, you're not going to see all these words. I did a little bit of personal translation because some of the words, I think there's possibly better English options to capture this. And phylacteries are basically little amulets, little charms, if you will, for lack of a better word. It's a Greek word for charm. That's what phylacteries is, a Greek word for charm. And in the Old Testament, and we'll get to this in a moment, there were actually instructions to the Jewish people, to the people of Israel, the nation of Israel, to wear certain things, to remind them of certain things. But Jesus says they make these little reminder amulets or charms, they make them huge. They were also supposed to put tassels on the corners of their garments, and we'll get to that in a moment as well. It was supposed to remind them of something spiritual. But they made their tassels conspicuous. They were these blue tassels or bluish-purple tassels. But the religious leaders had larger tassels or nicer tassels or braided tassels or, something to draw attention to themselves because it was all about attention. This is why God set those things out in the first place in Deuteronomy and Numbers. Deuteronomy 11, 18 to 21, God told Moses, imprint these words of mine on your hearts and minds. So that's the most important thing, right? Take what I'm telling you and put on your heart. But then he said, bind them as signs on your hands and let them be a symbol on your foreheads. And then he said, teach them to your children, talking about them when you sit in your house, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, when you get up. And then he says, and also write them on your doorposts of your house and put them on your city gates. So it was like they were supposed to serve as reminders. When you walked by a door and saw certain verses or certain laws from God's law in the Old Testament, God's instruction written on a door, you were reminded, oh yeah, like these people are looking to God for instruction. Or you saw it written on a city gate. Oh, this city, they prioritize the instructions of the Lord. And they would also do it personally. And so today, if you go into different cultures, you go into Israel or you go into Jewish communities, different places, you're going to see some of that displayed with people. They're wearing stuff that are called tefillin today, and they're little boxes, and there's a strap that holds the box on their forehead. A lot of times Jewish people wear that when they pray, and then they have straps that wrap around their arms. There's a little box that is right here at the bicep that's against the arm. And they'll put those on when they pray, all throughout Israel and Jewish communities today, to remind them of, God's word is central to my thoughts, and God's word should affect my actions. So those are great reminders. And maybe today, I would say in the Christian community in the United States, you can buy different religious accessories, right? You could buy a cross necklace, you could buy a Christian t-shirt or hat or something like that. You think those serve some good purposes? Do you think they can? Do you think that religious accessories can serve good purposes? What might be a good purpose of a religious accessory that maybe you're wearing one right now? What would be some reasons to wear one? Yeah. Okay? Why do you wear one?
Why?
Yeah, why do you wear a cross?
Because I've had people talk to me and say, oh, I like your cross, and that starts the whole conversation.
Okay.
I can go into my spiel, and, oh, and what church do you go to?
Okay.
That kind of thing, and then we're on the way.
Okay, so you might, so you might wear some sort of religious accessory to start a conversation. People ask you about it, and then there's an opportunity to share your faith with somebody. Yes. Okay, why?
So people know, so people see it.
Okay, to be seen. Okay, identified maybe you with that. Yes.
I actually wear mine as a reminder to me as to what his sacrifice was. One side has it, the other side
Sure.
does not, because he's living in my heart.
Oh, wow.
So it's a reminder to me.
So it's a reminder for you, it's a reminder of Jesus' sacrifice and that he's living inside of you. Yeah, okay? Yeah. And all those are, I would say, helpful reasons. But again, what was the motive of these religious leaders in Jesus' day? For the larger tassels and the big, boxes, phylacteries on their head.
We still do that, the Hasidic Jews still in Israel wear all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Include Israel, and we had a lot of Hasidic Jews on the plane, they all had that.
Yeah.
Arms and their heads.
You're correct. Yeah, the Jewish community still wears those today. But at this point in time, again, their motive was to draw attention. Because my box is bigger, because my tassel's longer, I'm more spiritual than you are. And that was the point, to showcase their spiritual commitment. Do the things that you wear really talk about the condition of your heart? No, right? You can wear the biggest cross necklace or the brightest Christian t-shirt, neon orange, and you can have a completely bad heart, right? Even though you're showcasing this on the outside. And that was the danger. Jesus goes on, he says, they love the best reclining places at formal dinners because in Jesus' day, you didn't go sit at chairs around a table. The tables were low against the floor, and so you take cushions a lot of times and lean on one side. And so certain versions of the Bible will translate it, Jesus was reclining at the table because he was literally leaning on some cushions at a table on the floor with people. I hope this doesn't fall over doing this. And they would lean, and then they would eat like this. The person next to you would be leaning as well, and that's how you sat around the table. But apparently, again, there were better reclining places, kind of like we have the head of the table today, maybe in certain occasions, or the head table for a wedding. And they loved the best seats in the synagogue. So later, again, this became an actual stone seat called the seat of Moses, perhaps, but this chair where the person who was qualified to interpret the law, or the most qualified, got to sit. And so what's the purpose of that? Again, to elevate you as the religious teachers being better than everyone else, or more honorable than everyone else. Jesus says in verse 7, they love greetings of honor in the marketplaces. So they want to be noticed. And the idea is, wow, you're one of those religious leaders. You're one of the political leaders in our city. We look up to you in the marketplace. Wow, greetings. Can we do a selfie? Guess who I saw in the marketplace today? I saw a Pharisee. I saw a scribe. I got a selfie with them. And to be called rabbi by people, and the actual word is under them. And the word rabbi means my master, right? I mean, these guys were really into attention. They love it when somebody comes up to them and says, my master. And when you use a phrase like that, it automatically expresses that you feel like you're beneath them and they are above you. And so they have this affection for the best seats at the dinners and the synagogue services. That's what they truly love. Not the people, but the attention. And then they have a pretty arrogant opinion of themselves. We're better than everyone else because we're the religious leaders, even though we won't lift up a finger to do some of the things that we're requiring of other people. We're better. We deserve more. And then Jesus stops because he's talking not necessarily to those people. He's talking about that group and the way that they approach life and spirituality. But he stops and talks to the crowds and his own disciples, and he says, but you are not to be called rabbi, my master. Don't long for that. Don't long for attention and to be exalted above other people. He says, because you have one teacher, and you're all brothers and sisters. Some translations capitalize the word teacher. In the original manuscripts, there weren't capital letters in these, but I think that the translators probably got that right. I think Jesus is referring to God as your teacher. You're all on the same level. And I would say that's for us as well. I might be standing here this morning, but we are all on the same level. You have gifts, I have gifts, you have flaws, I have flaws, probably more, and we're all brothers and sisters in this, and we're using the things God's given us to serve and love each other. And for some of you, it's growing a ton of fruit in your backyard and bringing it to bless people. For others of you, it's helping hold crying babies, so a mom or dad can have a little bit of a break, during a church service to be in here. For some of you, it's teaching or leading prayer times. It looks different for all of us, but we're all in this together. We're not better than one another. We're not worse than one another. We're brothers and sisters. So Jesus says, as far as all of you who are in my kingdom, don't call anyone on earth your father, because you have one Father who's in heaven. Don't be called leaders either, because you have one leader, the Messiah, this promised priest king who's God in the flesh. And what he's saying isn't like, get legalistic about this and don't call your dad on the phone and say, hi, Father. He's not talking about that. He's talking about this tendency in society then and in society today to say some people are better than other people. Some people deserve more attention than other people. Some people are lower than other people. He's saying, just realize you're all brothers and sisters. That's the point of this. So in the kingdom of heaven, God is leader, and we are all brothers and sisters. We're all in this together. We're on the same level. We're valuable because we're made in God's image, but we're all in this together. We're siblings. He says, the greatest among you will be your servant. And he's talked to his disciples about this earlier, a couple chapters before, because they get this idea that leading is being served. And so this is just reiteration of that to this whole crowd that's around him. He says, the greatest among you will be your servant. Whoever exalts himself, and that's what these religious leaders are trying to do. They're trying to lift themselves up. He says, whoever does that in life, they're out to get people's attention and make themselves look better than others. Those people are going to be humbled. And it begs the question, well, who's going to do the humbling? Because it's passive. It's something else or someone else is going to bring about the humbling. And he says, whoever humbles himself will be exalted. And the idea is you humble yourself through becoming a servant. And so he's saying to his community of people and to the crowds in general, your ambition should be to lift other people up above yourselves. And that's really our ambition as a community of followers of Jesus today. It should be. To lift up other people above ourselves, and then to let God decide if and when and how he lifts us up and exalts us in different ways. Sometimes he does. He takes people like Joseph, who really get sold into slavery and then end up being a slave in someone's household for years, and then gets falsely accused and thrown into prison. He gets the raw end of the deal, and he puts him in second command over a huge city in Egypt, under the leader at that point in time in the 1400s BC. So sometimes those stories happen. Sometimes he takes people like Mary, who's born in this insignificant town called Nazareth, as a young girl, maybe teenager at this point in time, and sends an angel one day and says, you're going to give birth to this Messiah figure who's been anticipated since the first page of Genesis. This one who's going to crush the snake and deliver the people and bring freedom and all of this and bring a reconnection with God. You're going to be the mother of that person. Sometimes he comes out of the blue. And sometimes it's years. Sometimes other people go through much suffering and trials in life. And maybe their elevation comes later when they meet Jesus face to face. We don't know. But God's the one who's in charge of that. It's not our position to seek attention, elevation. It's our position to try to lift up other people around us. And Jesus has said things like that before. Love your neighbor as yourself. Even love your neighbor above yourself. Or even things like love your enemy, right? And so we're lifting up other people. And the neighbor is pretty broad. The neighbor isn't the person who you agree with. The neighbor isn't the person who necessarily loves you. The neighbor might even be your enemy. The neighbor might be the person like the Samaritan who has totally different religious ideas than you have. Or the person that's a little bit, different approach to culture than you have. Or the person with a completely different ethnicity or history than you have. Neighbor just means near one. It's the people God happens to bring close to you in life, regardless of what kinds of people they are. That's your neighbor. And so that should be our ambition. Lift other people up. Don't worry about lifting ourselves up. And God will use people or himself to do that in his time if he wants to bring encouragement to us that way. He will do the exalting. The final thing that Jesus talks about as we kind of wrap up this morning is this issue. I'm going to call it admission in a sense. We're talking about admission into God's kingdom. I'm going to set up a scenario for you today, okay? I want you to imagine if you've been to Disneyland or Disney World, try to envision that. But there is a Disneyland or Disney World employee. And this person says, I work for the Magic Kingdom. And they have a uniform to prove that they work for the Magic Kingdom. And not only that, but they have this huge name tag. If you've seen the Disney employees, like they have kind of this oval name tag, but theirs is huge, and it has their name on it as well. And then they have a pair of mouse ears, and their mouse ears are oversized, and they're covered in jewels, diamonds. They are the quintessential Disney employee. But when you talk to them, you realize, and they tell you, I've never been inside the gates of the Magic Kingdom, but I'm an employee. I work for the Magic Kingdom. I've just never been inside before. And then when you see how they approach people, they're working at the ticket gate. They take the tickets and people come in to the Magic Kingdom. And you notice when people walk up, they try to discourage everybody who's not wearing some form of Disney clothing or memorabilia from entering. So if there's kids and they've got on the, Moana t-shirt or something like that, it's come right in. But if there's somebody that looks like they might be less than an avid Disney fan because they're just dressed in normal clothes or normal shoes, or even worse, they have a product from a competitor like Universal Studios plastered on their t-shirt, they're like, I'm sorry, you can't enter. You're not serious enough about Disney today. I mean, they're turning down kids and adults and grandparents and everybody because they believe those people aren't serious enough. And if they go in, because they're not diehard Disney fans, because obviously diehard Disney fans would have the clothing or the accessories to prove it, they're just going to take away from the experiences of everybody else in Disneyland for that day. So why have them in there if they're just going to take away from people's experience? Oh, and there's one more thing. Every year, this employee takes a trip around the world to recruit other employees for Disneyland. And they look for only the most seriously minded, dedicated Disney individuals who are going to take their job seriously. They hand out 500-question Disney trivia quizzes, and only the people who ace it are good enough to be employed at Disney. And you also have to own at least $10,000 in Disney stock, or you might not be serious enough to be a Disney employee. And you probably have to have at least 1 or 2 scripts of complete Disney movies committed to your memory in order to be a valid Disney employee. And most importantly, you have to make sure that the other people who come into Disneyland are going to take Disneyland just as seriously as you do. And if those people won't, you never let them enter. Let's imagine that you had 600 Disneyland employees with that type of attitude. How would that affect the experience at Disneyland? Tell me, how would that affect things? I have a point to this, but what would that do to people's experience? It wouldn't make it the happiest place on earth. That's probably sure, right? What did somebody else say?
I'd be seeking an alternative.
You'd be seeking an alternative, right? I'm going to take my vacay somewhere else this year, thank you.
You decide immediately whether you belong or you don't belong.
Okay, yeah, it draws the line. Like it says you either belong or you don't belong. And yet, when I think about Disney, I think a lot of times the point of it is to give new experiences to people. And I see grandparents introducing their grandkids to that or to other theme parks or maybe even other experiences that they had when they were a child. Maybe you take them to a certain cabin that you went to, you take them fishing, or you take them to a certain city, or you take them on a family trip that you went on when you were growing up. But you introduce these experiences because you hope that the next generation will begin to love these things just as much as you do. And there's joy from experiencing and seeing something from the first time. And if you make it all about the seriousness and the dedication, you take that childlike joy and you completely suck it out. It's a vacuum and there's nothing left, right? Which is kind of probably the point, or one of the points, why the Disney realm was created in the first place, is to bring that childlike joy and experience to people. And now, instead of imagining 600 Disney employees that approach the Magic Kingdom that way, imagine that you have 600 or actually 6,000 is more reflective of the number at the time in Israel at this point, Pharisees, or Pharisees and scribes, who have a similar approach to God's kingdom, how you get into God's kingdom. Here's what Jesus says in commentary of that. I think it reveals that they have a very similar approach. He says, woe to you. And when we read words like woe, it's almost like a term of judgment or condemnation, like, woe to you, may God condemn you. May you be sentenced to life apart from God forever. That's kind of what we interpret into it from the way that woe is used, very rarely used in our language in English today. But it's actually in this culture, when you read the word woe in the Bible, it's an expression of grief. It's not really, it's like one of those things like when you make a sound that everybody realizes, oh, they're grieving, right? Or say something like, why? And you realize that somebody's in terrible pain. And the word was, wahi. That's how they'd say it. But it was this word that kind of was a sound, and everybody knew like your heart was grieving at that point in time. And oftentimes it was in response to what you realized somebody else was going through or would go through someday that would cause them grief and hardship. And so it was a word, like a mourning word, a mourning cry that you would say in that culture. And so Jesus is saying something like, if you could only see the heartache that awaits you, Pharisees and scribes. That's what that word means in the way that we would describe it. And then he calls them hypocrites. And again, we think, well, Jesus is calling them hypocrite. He's judging them because we use the word hypocrite in a pretty degrading way a lot of times in our culture. But it just means somebody who's acting a part or somebody who's a pretender. Somebody who thinks they have something so well, but they're really just playing a part, which again characterizes these religious leaders. They think they're being so religious, but they're really just acting from God's perspective. They don't grasp what their role is really like. In fact, they're so misguided. And Jesus is mourning that and mourning the fact that one day they're going to realize their approach to all of this was so misguided. And they're going to be upset, and they're going to be sorrowful over that. He says, you shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces, for you don't go in. You're missing out. And it's like they have mistaken their own world of all these requirements and demands, the ones that they're not even willing to carry out themselves, that they're putting on other people. They have mistaken their own world, their own kingdom for God's kingdom. And the thing that they're going about creating is not at all what God wants to create. God wants to create something that can be celebrated, something that can bring joy and a newness to people who have never experienced it before. And the Pharisees think that by all of their dedication, they're creating a place, but they're really just excluding people and they're putting up barriers. He says next, Jesus says, and you don't allow those entering to go in. So people want to come and they want to experience this, and they hear about this kingdom of God, this community of people who are reunited in a relationship with God, care about each other, that love each other, who are serving each other, who are there for each other, who are learning and understanding God and each other more, and they want to be a part of it. And the Pharisees are standing outside the gate saying, you don't want to be a part of that, and you're not dedicated enough to be anyway. So why don't you take your desire for commitment somewhere else? He says they're causing people to miss out on the abundant life, the joy that can be experienced in God's kingdom because of all the demands they're trying to put on it. Totally misguided. And he closes this way. He says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, pretenders, actors. You travel over land and sea to make one convert. And when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of Gehenna as you are. Some versions say a son of hell as you are, but the word is literally Gehenna. There's a little bit of backstory. And Gehenna has to do with misery. Gehenna is a Hebrew word. Gen Hinnom is a valley that's described in the Old Testament in several different places. Get or Gen means valley. Hinnom means mourning or sorrow. And a son of the valley of mourning is probably the best way to interpret that. And the valley in the Old Testament was called Ge, or the valley of Ben Hinnom, the son of Hinnom, the son of mourning. So Jesus is switching around those words, and he's saying the son of the valley of mourning. He's making a play on words from that. But he's hinting at the fact that these Pharisees, they're trying to bring people into seeing religion and spirituality and a relationship with God the way that they do, But what they're really creating is an experience that's going to be twice as miserable for everyone that they bring into their way of seeing God's kingdom than the life that they're already living outside of God's kingdom. That way, that oppressive way, is twice as miserable. The people that they're converting are being totally led away from what God's kingdom is all about. This magical kingdom where people actually experience joy and relationship and celebration and love. And yes, life is hard and life is difficult, but people are there for each other. Instead of just sitting in an office, sipping coffee, thinking about how to make life more miserable and how to exalt ourselves and how to bring up our own selfishness and fulfill that. That's not what the kingdom is about. And it's a beautiful, I think, just commentary from Jesus on what we're supposed to be about as people. So I want to leave you with these thoughts, some questions to ask over the course of this week. Namely, the overhead, the big picture, what is life and life in God's kingdom truly about? Is it about you pleasing the most people? Is it about you getting the most attention from people? Is it about you being able to fulfill all your selfish desires before you take your last breath on earth? Is it about you doing as little as possible and watching other people struggle, so that you can be exalted and elevated? What's it really about? Is it about something different? Is it to demand perfection and detailed attention to all these traditions, or to just be diligent about meeting the needs of your neighbors, no matter what they look like, or act like, or think, or believe, so they can experience a little bit of Jesus' love? Is it to gain attention, or is it to give attention? And that's hard. Some of you are givers, and I think all of us too at the core, we really want acknowledgement from the things that we do. It's really hard when you're giving attention. And the idea is not that you'll never get that attention, but it's that God and other people decide when you do. You don't have to seek it for yourself because your focus is on giving attention to other people. Is it about lifting ourselves up above other people, or is it about seeing each other as brothers and sisters and actually trying to lift other people up, trusting that maybe they'll return the favor and support you? Because when we're all lifting each other up, we still get lifted up. But when we're lifting ourselves up, we get lifted up and everybody else gets stomped on beneath our feet. Is life about weeding people out of God's kingdom or weeding people out of your church? Because these people, they don't think like we do. They don't believe everything that I believe. They have a few different opinions about God or about life. Is it about how we can weed people out and make a church where uniformity characterizes everybody? Or is it a church where we're very different, but somehow we still find a way to be unified? Are we about welcoming people into our church community, welcoming people into God's kingdom, knowing everybody's at a different place, God is their master, and he'll show different things to different people at different times. So he's going to bring us all along as he wants to bring us all along, and we're here for each other? Or is it about, again, who can we get out of here so that our church is comfortable for us and everybody looks like us? How exciting that is. It's a different kind of kingdom. So which one are we trying to advance?